Welcome to this presentation on the Committee on Climate Change's Renewable Energy Review. I'm Adair Turner, Chairman of the committee. What we are doing today is to launch this report called the Renewable Energy Review, and the genesis of this was in the coalition agreement of the government in May last year, where there was an agreement that the Climate Change Committee would look at the issue of how stretching should be targets for. Now, the basic background to remember is that at present, renewable energy, on the way that it's accounted, accounts for only 3% of total renewable energy. That's on the 2009 figures. It'll have gone up a bit in 2010, but not dramatically up. And we have a commitment under the EU directive to achieve a target of 15% renewable energy by 2020. And you can see at the moment how it looks across the different sectors. That 3% is made up of 6.6% in electricity, but only 1.6% in heating and 2.5% in transport. So we were asked to say, what should be the targets looking forward? And we were asked in two steps. First of all, we were asked to provide a brief statement last September, which we did, on whether we should revisit the 15% target or increase the 15% target for 2020. And our recommendation was that we should not increase that because there isn't a great value in public policy in simply increasing targets and then not meeting them. We said the crucial thing was to have the policies that made sure that you truly met the 15% target in the first place. Because actually there are lead times in public policy and it's not all that easy to change quickly. So we reconfirmed the 15% energy target but did not recommend an increase. But what that, of course, in itself illustrates is the importance of having a vision out for 20 or 30 years, because that's the time period over which you can really use public policy to drive for much higher targets. So what this Renewable Energy Review does, it builds on our fourth budget recommendations. I'll just come back to them in a minute, and it looks to 2030 and beyond. It sets out some new technical and economic analysis. It presents a range of scenarios for renewable energy. It considers the implications of where we want to be in 2030 for some details of where we might want to be in 2020, and it assesses some of the key enabling factors, the key policies required to make what we're suggesting credible. Just on the fourth budget report, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but in December we produced a set of recommendations for the size of the fourth carbon budget from 2023 to 2027. The key figure to bear in mind is 1,950. So that is what we are looking for from the government, 1,950 million tonnes, and not more than that. That recommendation was based upon a vision of where we have to be in 2030 in order to make the achievement of the 80% reduction by 2050, which is in the Climate Change Act, truly credible. So the Renewables Review sits within that overall vision of where we have to be in the mid-2020s and indeed by 2030. Our key messages from this review that we're presenting today are that renewables are part of a range of promising options for decarbonisation. And we do, as a committee, believe that you can't put all your eggs in one basket, that there need to be a variety of technologies being used, but renewables are certainly a very important element of them. And we are setting out scenarios which show renewables from, remember, 3% today, 15% in 2020, getting to, say, 30% of all energy by 2030. And you'll see that that also implies a still higher level for electricity by then. And indeed, it could be higher, could be up to, we think, maybe an absolute maximum by 2030 of a 45%. We believe within that a portfolio approach is appropriate for power sector decarbonisation. We place a lot of emphasis on power sector decarbonisation, and we are not recommending that we do it all with renewables, or all with nuclear, or all with carbon capture and storage. We believe that the appropriate way forward is a combination of those, But that involves action to make sure that the ones which are presently more expensive, and that does include offshore wind as well as marine, are supported to, as best possible, drive them through the cost curve reduction process so that they have the best chance of being a low-cost alternatives by 2030. In relation to heat, the key challenge is actually delivery. In heat, because it has a lot to do with what goes on in people's houses, the devil is in the detail of whether people are accredited, how the renewables heat incentive works, how you persuade people to grasp the technologies that will be available. And as for transport biofuels, we still have a relatively cautious point of view here. And that cautious point of view is based upon the same considerations which led the Gallagher review the year before last to suggest that we should not be increasing our targets under the road transport fuel obligation, and that we at the moment should be fairly cautious because some of the biofuels out there are not truly sustainable across the world. Could change with technologies. We have a major project this year to look at the whole issue of bioenergy, but at the moment you'll see that our aims on renewables through the biofuels rather than through electric cars are relatively cautious. So those are the key messages we're going to set out. I'm going to do it in 4 sections. First of all, one chart on the overall decarbonisation challenge, placing this within the overview, the context of the Climate Change Act and of the 4th carbon budget. In 1990, UK emissions about 800 million tonnes. 2050, get them down by 80%. That is down to 160 million tonnes that you see on the right. But note that some of those are very difficult to reduce. We'll try hard to keep them flat. That includes international aviation and shipping, the pink bit. Some of them are relatively difficult to reduce. Some of the non-CO2s, and in particular agriculture, those are covered in that dark green bit on the right-hand side. And that actually means that the grey bit on the right-hand side, which is everything else, will have to come down by something like 90% below its 1990 levels to hit that overall 80% envelope. And that means that we have to achieve really radical reductions in 3 areas in particular: in power, in electricity, that is, in buildings, in particular heat, in transport. We also have to reduce it in industry. You'll notice that in our figures there, a lot of the reduction in industry is likely to come after 2030 rather than before. But what I'm going to talk today about is particularly focused on what we have to do to bring down power, buildings and transport emissions. And those are the 3 topics I'm going to focus on. So the sections we're going to go through are power, then heat, then transport. And under power, as you can see, 5 subsections. First, the strategic importance of power. Like many people who've looked at the challenge of building a low-carbon economy, we see taking the carbon out of electricity generation as not only important in itself, because there's 170 million tonnes coming from electricity generation today, but because once we've decarbonised electricity, we can then apply it to new applications in the economy, in particular to surface transport and heat. So we think it is particularly important to have very stretching targets by 2030 to decarbonise the power sector. We see it likely, top left-hand side, that the actual terawatt hours of electricity demand will increase significantly by 2030 and beyond. So we're saying that despite energy efficiency improvements in the use of electricity, the application of electricity to a wider set of uses mean that we actually are consuming more terawatt hours in 2030 and even more in 2050 than we do today. And that implies that in order to decarbonise electricity generation, to achieve the emissions reduction over on the right-hand side, we have got to get a reduction in grams per kilowatt hour to something like 50 grams per kilowatt hour by 2030 versus the 500 or so grams per kilowatt hour that we are at in today in 2011. So, how are we going to do that? And what is the role of renewables? Well, we've thought about, first of all, the total level of resource available of renewables, then issues to do with intermittency, and then issues to do with economics. And actually, of those 3, The really constraining one, the most important one, is probably economics, because in sheer resource terms and in dealing with intermittency, we could in power generation go to very high levels of use of renewables if we were simply willing to pay whatever it costs to deal with the intermittency problems. So if you look at the resource here, what this illustrates is what we define and various other people define as a practical resource. There's an interesting, very neatly designed illustration within the report. I'll just tell you what page it is, on page 50, of how you go from a theoretical resource to a technical resource to a definition of a practical resource and then an economic resource. Well, this is already 3 steps down in terms of getting rid of, we're not going to put windmills in national parks or areas of outstanding national beauty. So it's got it down to a sensible level of what you could definitely do. And as you can see, this is suggesting that there's an estimated practical resource for UK renewables of 860 terawatt hours per year, which is above the even increased level of demand that we see in the future. So in pure, could you do it in physical and practical resource terms, you could have a very high percentage. As you'll see in terms of where that resource is, the great bulk is in offshore wind, but there are also important potential contributions from solar PV, a bit more believable over the last month than in normal British weather, but actually, as many of you know, solar PV is a technology which doesn't require direct bright sunlight all the time. Tidal stream, onshore wind, tidal range. Just to give you an idea here, within those onshore wind figures, as we say, that has already excluded from consideration areas where it's highly unlikely that anybody will ever agree to have a windmill, even if it's physically possible to have it. So there is a major resource available, but there are also resources available in the other technologies. We do not believe that there are fuel shortages limiting the expansion of nuclear across the world, certainly before 2050. The resource application there is probably the limit to the number of sites where people will support the fact that nuclear plants can be based, and that may create some resource limit there. As for carbon capture and storage, we believe that you look at coal supplies and gas supplies, the problem that the world has is not how little it has, but how much in climate change terms. And the more important constraining resource capacity here may eventually be CO2 storage capacity if the world wants to go very dramatically down the line of carbon capture and storage. So in resource terms, there are a combination of different ways to meet the low carbon challenge. If we then focus on renewables, can we deal with the problem of intermittency within renewables, the problem of what happens when the wind doesn't blow? Well, there are 4 categories of things that you can do when the wind doesn't grow. You can have a process whereby you are shifting your demand, and with more smart meters and more electricity being used in things like heat storage systems or the electric cars, there is a greater ability to move the demand around a bit. There is also a greater ability to move supply around the more that we are interconnected with the rest of the continent, because on the whole, when it blows in one place, it isn't blowing elsewhere and vice versa. And a renewables grid with a large amount of activity from wind, generation from wind, should be one in which we move to a more interconnected grid across the continent. Obviously then, there is the use of flexible generation like CCGT to cover the peaks, and there is detailed analysis in the report of how that would operate. And then there are the issues of actually having storage. The vehicles eventually, with the batteries in vehicles, can be used not simply to say, I will power them up when the wind is blowing, not immediately before I need them, but if I power them up on Monday and I know that I'm not going to drive the car till Saturday, on Tuesday or Wednesday, with appropriate smart meters, I can be selling the electricity back to the grid if necessary. The more batteries we have around and other forms of storage, the more that we have created a flexible system. There is detailed analysis in the review of that, and that suggests that renewable shares of up to 65% by 2030 and 80% by 2050 are at least feasible without the cost of intermittency cover becoming completely prohibitive. So we do not believe that the intermittency problems are constraints on the sort of figures that we've ended up with in our scenarios, which is, say, a 40% base case scenario for electricity from renewables in 2030. So the crucial thing then becomes the costs. And obviously there's a huge amount of work can go into the costs, and it depends on all sorts of assumptions. And one of the crucial things that we have to say is none of us know definitively what the relative cost will be in 2030. These are estimates. But let me show you 3 pages which give an idea of how we, using various consulting inputs, have thought about the costs. Background to this cost is an assumption that whatever else happens, there's a carbon price there. A carbon price something like set out in the government's assumptions of the carbon price underpin, moving to, say, £30 per tonne by 2020, and then up to about £70 a tonne by 2030. So that's a background which applies in everything that you see here. With those in place, how will we compare the cost of unabated gas as the default generation option with various forms of renewables, or with nuclear, or abated gas or coal carbon capture and storage? Well, in 2020, and using a commercial discount rate, in this case of a 10% discount rate, I would say that compared with the unabated gas over on the right-hand side at 5 to 11p per kilowatt hour, depending on what you think the cost of gas will be, there are a couple of technologies which we believe by then are reasonably economic against that simply on the carbon price. And those are, on the left-hand side, offshore wind, and just towards the right, nuclear. And our best guess is that both of those are reasonably economic on those carbon prices alone. There are then some technologies, the 4 higher green ones, which I think almost everybody would agree are, on this basis in 2020, still significantly more expensive than any of those. Those are solar PV, tidal stream, wave, and tidal range, the 7 barrage. And then there is offshore wind, which is a bit of an intermediate, but still clearly, in 2020, likely to be significantly more expensive. The ranges that people have of 10 to 15 for offshore wind not overlapping with the range that people have for onshore or for nuclear. So that's a picture in 2020. If you roll forward to 2030 with reasonable estimates of what might happen to costs over time, we see it likely that offshore wind by that time will have got closer to the range of affordability. The others will have come down, but still relatively expensive. And so we think it is worthwhile continuing to stimulate and encourage those other technologies, and in particular offshore wind, which we think over time could come into the range of cost effectiveness with that carbon price. The final thing we then do is play around with the discount rate, because of course some people say from a society's point of view, as against a private investor's point of view, why are you using a 10% discount rate? Isn't that disadvantaging low carbon technologies which are of their nature capital intensive, operating cost limited? And that does change. It quite changes very significantly the relative cost of some of the very capital intensive things like 7 barrage or some of the tidal stream systems, or indeed solar PV. It doesn't radically change the relativities. You still end up believing, because nuclear improves very significantly on that as well, you still end up believing that nuclear or onshore wind are likely to be the lower cost, but offshore wind on that basis very, very clearly competitive with the fossil fuel-based one. So this tries to sum up how we have thought about the economics and the resource availability and some of the other factors in these different technologies, and why at the end we basically say that we need a portfolio approach in which we are not backing one horse but being willing to go forward with several different technologies. Nuclear, we think, is likely to emerge as the lowest cost in the medium term, not necessarily the long-term low carbon option, but there are long-term limitations about sites, about waste storage, about public attitudes, and I think even those people who look at the economics of nuclear and believe that it has a role over the next 50 years certainly don't want to give up on the idea that by the end of this century we could have moved beyond that technology and not be perpetually producing more and more nuclear waste. And if there are other options which are capable of becoming economic, then we should be driving those as well. Onshore wind, we think, is a clearly economic prospect, but there are acceptability constraints. These vary by different countries. Different countries seem to have a different degree of acceptability of them, but that does illustrate for society a bit of choice that people have. If people were more willing to accept onshore wind turbines, we can buy renewables electricity at a somewhat lower cost than if we insist on putting it offshore. But that's a trade-off society simply has to make. How much is it willing to pay for what it perceives as being attractive countryside, etc. Offshore wind, we believe, is currently more expensive but could come down, and if it does come down, then the resource and the acceptability is pretty much limitless, because there is a lot of offshore wind out there. And all of those we see as a potential major role in the UK. There are then ones, carbon capture and storage and tidal stream and wave, where we believe they are less certain at this stage. Basically, the key thing with CCS is we've still got to demonstrate it at scale, but where we believe that the UK does have a potential role in helping drive down their cost, and therefore we should be supporting them and supporting demos. You again get solar PV. The key thing to say about solar PV is it may eventually, even in Britain, given the more optimistic cost curves that people have, become a major contributor by mid-century. But frankly, what we do technologically as a country is almost irrelevant to whether solar PV goes down its cost curve. Whereas in offshore wind, whether or not we go down that cost curve is heavily influenced by what the UK does. With solar PV, we will simply be the takers of a price set by world trends, and anything we do to pump prime solar PV is pretty minimal compared with what will happen in the US, in Spain, in Germany, or other countries like that. Tidal barrage, our overall approach to that is it's available at a certain cost. It's a known technology, that's a good thing. On the other hand, the point about known technologies is unlikely that there's any great extra cost reduction which is going to be achieved there. We would not therefore be suggesting that we press the button immediately on 7 tidal barrage, but if some of those other cost reductions don't become available, it is an option on a known technology. We take all that together, and what we are suggesting in a scenario, we are not in the business of predicting nor of planning precisely, but taking that together, we think a not unreasonable scenario would have something like this. By 2030, going to a mix of perhaps 40% renewables, 38% nuclear, 14% carbon capture and storage, 8% unabated gas. Now, obviously, different people will disagree with that particular mix. Some people are much more optimistic about carbon capture and storage. If carbon capture and storage costs come down, if it's illustrated well at scale, then maybe there should be more of that and less of the others. But what we are clear about is we believe that there should be a portfolio approach, which is some balance of these different mixes of technology, rather than placing all our eggs in one basket, be it CCS or nuclear or renewables. Now, how to ensure then that this comes about? I think one of the crucial things is that we need support for the technologies which are presently more expensive, and we need that support to be intelligently long-term in its nature. At the moment, with the current plans for offshore wind, there are indicative plans within what DEC have produced, etc., and within the commitments of the ROC regime, which left to themselves could be sending a signal that says that we're going to ramp up our investment all the way to 2020s, but we're not sure whether we're going to support it in the 2020s or not. And we believe that one of the crucial things now is to begin to have a vision of where we're going to be in 2030. We believe that vision has to influence the new energy market arrangements. The current market structure of the energy market was designed to achieve specific objectives of reducing cost of fossil fuel generation electricity in the 1990s, but it is completely unfit for purpose when you are dealing with a set of technologies which have very high fixed cost and low marginal cost. That is why we have been in the committee strongly in favour of electricity market reform, which will create a set of mechanisms to give to low carbon generators a combination of price and quantity certainty going out into the 2020s. But we believe some of those contracts, the contracts for difference, effectively a way of constructing a sort of feed-in tariff, that some of those should be technology specific, that some of them should be reserved for the currently more expensive technologies to help them to drive down the cost curve, and in particular for offshore wind, for marine and CCS, which compared with onshore wind or nuclear are the ones which we think are less likely to work simply on the basis of the generalised electricity market reform plus the carbon price. Within that context, there may be a possibility, a need to consider whether we should slightly smooth the path of offshore wind growth. At the moment, we have in the stuff that we've produced, the stuff that DEC has produced, they intended green profile, but no certainty of what happens in the 2020. If we were aiming for that indicative target for 2030, you might well set it, but also slightly reduce the ambition for 2020. And the reason why that is important is that driving for that level of ambition in 2020 at the margin is something which is driving extra cost through to the electricity bills. So we are flagging that if it is possible to get, and I think there's a mistake there in the first thing, it ought to say more onshore wind, requiring greater community support, or more renewable heat, or to use more imports such as concentrated solar power or renewable energy credits. If there are other ways of meeting the 15% renewable energy target in 2020, we would not be averse to a slight reduction in the 2020 target for offshore wind, while simultaneously combining that with setting some strong targets for still higher levels in 2030. And we think that that sort of a slightly lower in 2020 but higher in 2030 would actually give the industry more of that continuity and long-term perspective which it needs to drive a supply chain development. Let me turn to the issue of heat. Heat is responsible for, out of total CO2, energy CO2 emissions, I think I'm right here, in 2008, of 525 million tonnes. 220 of that, the blue area on the left-hand side, is coming from heat. So something like 40% of all our emissions are to do with keeping ourselves warm in various ways, either, as you can see on the right, in residential. 100 million tonnes is coming from residential heat, 80 million tonnes in non-residential commercial buildings, if this was winter, keeping us warm where we are today, and then industry, where that includes both ambient heat and intense heat in industrial processes. So clearly, given that 220 million tonnes, the reduction of heat is going to be incredibly important. And we see a variety of different technologies available for decarbonising heat, of which some of the most attractive are those to do with heat pumps, air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, ultimately, of course, driven by electricity, but using that electricity to produce heat in a very efficient fashion. The use of biomass directly in both industrial, commercial and residential boilers, and the creation of biogas and introduction of biogas into the gas grid. These heat technologies, again, one can look at the different economics of them, and I won't go through the details, but it is set out in the report. We see the possibility that by 2030, many of these could be highly cost effective. I mean, air source heat pumps in particular which you can see over on the left-hand side, we think have the real possibility of becoming a highly competitive with alternatives, simply running a gas boiler in your home by 2030. But they do require cost reductions, and they also, crucially, have a set of complicated issues about how to get consumer acceptability and the actual installation of them. Here, the challenge is not just the technology, but the acceptability. But we can see the possibility that by 2030, we could be putting 35% of residential heat over on the left-hand side onto a renewable basis, and you can see, particularly if you can look quickly at the colour code, air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps playing a particularly important role. And on non-residential commercial buildings, we could see that as high as 75%. If I then turn to the issue of industry, this chart that I'm going to show here actually includes not just heat in industry, this 120 million tonnes, but also process emissions in industry, for instance, from cement and steel manufacture, which have not just the heat input, but process emissions. And you can see here that we are suggesting a significant ability to introduce renewable heat into industry by then. But you can also see that industry, and it was something I flagged earlier, is going to be an area where beyond 2030 we are going to have to drive for much bigger reductions if we're going to meet those 2050 targets. And indeed, within industry, we are going to have to eventually start applying carbon capture and storage probably to the process CO2 emissions as well as to the heat CO2 emissions of industry. Overall, what that means is, looking across buildings, residential, commercial and industry, we could see us in the heat sector going from the very low level of 1.6% that we are at renewables today to as high as 12% by 2020 and 35% by 2030. So again, how are we going to get there? What are the barriers to that? We did some modelling of how many terawatt hours might come from renewable heat. There's our central scenario, 12% on the left-hand side by 2020. And then there's a set of scenarios that said, well, what happens if some things are not in place? What happens if there isn't a renewable heat incentive? Well, it won't happen. This thing does need to be subsidised originally to make it happen. What happens if there's slow progress on energy efficiency? You might think of energy efficiency as an alternative to renewable heat, but actually some of these renewable heat technologies, in particular air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, make most sense if you are simultaneously insulating your houses much better, because they work on a much lower level of heat that you're putting into the system. They don't work in the way that you can make your house hot at the moment by pumping a lot of really hot water around and making up for the fact that the heat's all going out through the walls by having really hot radiators. These do not work well in that sort of environment. They work much better if you've got very well insulated houses. So unless we make progress on energy insulation of houses, we will get logically slower uptake. We'll get slower uptake if we have less awareness, less confidence, less supply chain growth. And all that helps define what do we have to do in policy intervention to make it work. We need ongoing financial support. There is announced support to 2015, and we believe that that is broadly appropriate. We believe there will need to be increased funding beyond 2015 and further support in the 2020s. And in particular, we think domestic heat pumps will need support. We think there's a very important area here to do with the accreditation and training of installers and suppliers. This, as I said earlier, is an area where the devil is in the detail. You just need a whole lot of people out there who are going to be good at installing this stuff. And we believe that the government needs to try and work out an integration of renewable heat incentives and encouragement and information with energy efficiency incentives and encouragement and implementation. The Green New Deal and the renewable heat incentives need to be brought closer together, because we will get people to act if we can give them one-stop shops to which they can go at one and the same time to improve the insulation of their houses and simultaneously put in new forms of renewable heat technology. Finally, let me turn to transport. Transport is dominated by cars. Other things are also important. In particular, vans have been increasing emissions from that very rapidly recently, and HGVs are important, but it's fundamentally a road transport. This, by the way, is surface only. Aviation, there's another 40 million tonnes there, which I'm not covering here, so this is surface transport. So we do think, however, that on surface transport, the most important thing is to get down the emissions from cars and also vans. Again, the framework that we always use is to try and have an assumption on what might happen to demand. Demand in this case is vehicle kilometres. You can see it just came down a bit with the recession on the top left-hand side, but we suspect there is a tendency for that to continue to increase somewhat in the future, which means we are going to have to radically reduce the grams per kilometre. That's the key measure there. Average grams per kilometre in the UK, across the car fleet at the moment, about 169 grams per kilometre. We've definitely got to get that well below 100 by 2030. Now, how do we do that? We believe that electrical cars will eventually play a major role in that. It does take a long time for them to do that, because you simply have in cars a stock flow effect that even once we've hit quite a high share of new cars being electrical, we will then take some time before the whole stock is there. We have set out in the fourth carbon budget a stretching vision in which low carbon vehicles, either plug-in hybrids or pure electric, could be 60% of new cars by 2030. But note that at that time, we'd still have 70% of miles would be being done by existing conventional cars. However, getting a high level of penetration of electric cars by 2030 is then crucially important for the progress that we made in the 2040s and 50s. So we're thinking in terms of average emissions intensity in 2030. You can see it over on the right-hand side, getting the intensity of new car grams per kilometre down from today's 144 to something like 50 by then, and then going down to a lower figure beyond that. So the average all cars in the road, 169 in 2009, down to 80 by then. So that is part of the story that we tell in terms of what happens to cars. And as I said earlier, we are then cautious about pushing the button on trying to commit to any higher drive at the moment in terms of biofuels. 5% is the renewable transport fuel obligation by 2013-2014, from a present level of a little bit less than 3% today. The Gallagher review, which looked at this 2 years ago, and in particular at the complicated issues to do with real total carbon cycle of biofuels and sustainability, recommended that we should not be pushing it up to 10 or 15% by 2020, that 5 to 8% is as far as you can go by 2020, and be confident that that is available from reasonably sustainable and truly low carbon sources. So that is what we have reflected in our approach. But we will this year be doing a much more detailed study of the whole of bioenergy. And we will be looking at the range of technologies, because it is possible that people will come along with much more sustainable technologies in biofuels in the future. And if that is the case, then that could transform our attitudes to biofuels. This study on bioenergy will look at the totality of the bioenergy resource and the issue of where it is most appropriately used. Because remember, even if there is a lot of bioenergy available, you might want to use it not in biofuels for cars. Broadly speaking, if there's a limited amount of biofuels which can be sustainably sourced across the world, we will probably have to end up using those in the applications where there is no alternative. There is no alternative at the moment that anybody can think of for getting a plane off the ground, except with some category of liquid fuel. There are alternatives probably for cars, and therefore it's quite possible that even if there is a large role for biofuels, it isn't necessarily in the car space. On the other hand, if people can crack some of the visions of second and third generation biofuels, there's no reason why we wouldn't change our mind and have a different policy. What does all this mean in terms of illustrative scenarios for total renewable energy to 2030? Well, there we are at 3% today. We do believe the 2020 target of 15% is achievable, shouldn't be increased, but we should focus on achieving it. And we're setting out a vision today of something like 30% by 2030, could be up to 45% depending on cost reductions and the costs and feasibility of other alternatives. As you can see down the bottom right-hand side, that is coming from a balance of stretching targets of electricity going up to 40%, pretty stretching targets for renewable heat going to 35%. And I think that is an important point of our message, that renewable heat is something that we've really got to drive for. Relatively cautious targets at the moment in terms of road transport. Final point, what does this mean for the potential bill impacts of renewable energy ambition, which we are required in all our work to comment on what this means for the bills for ordinary people. Supporting renewable electricity under the current plans will probably add about 2p per kilowatt hour to electricity prices in 2020. And as we point out, the last pence of that is heavily influenced by just how hard you go for offshore wind, and you could trim it back a bit. That's 50 to 60 pounds an increase in an electricity bill against average electricity bills of £600 against average energy bills, gas and electricity, of about £1,400. Now, you can very significantly offset that in households by energy efficiency, if necessary. If we're worried about the competitiveness of electricity-intensive industry, you could do tax rebates and things like that. In households, however, the most important offset is the ability of people faced with a 10% increase in their electricity, in a 5% increase in their energy bill, to reduce their energy use by 10 or 15%. Supporting renewable heat to 2020, at the moment, under the existing plans of government, that is not put onto the energy bills. That is taken as a fiscal cost, and we foresee the need for about a fiscal cost support of about £2 billion per year by 2020. Beyond 2020, what is interesting is that if you've put in as an assumption in any case that rising carbon price, the extra cost of going to renewables is hardly there at all. Basically, once you've got a carbon price of 30 going to 70, these technologies are beginning to become fully cost competitive with the fossil fuel alternatives. So, just to repeat what I said at the beginning, we see renewables as one among a range of promising options. We think they should play a major role. We're talking about setting an indicative, illustrative target of 30% of energy by 2030 in a central case, could under certain circumstances be higher. We believe in power sector decarbonisation. We should have a portfolio choice which includes renewables and nuclear and carbon capture and storage, and within that we do believe it makes sense to support some of the technologies which are presently more expensive. Those include offshore wind and marine. Key challenge for renewable heat is to take the technologies which are developing at the moment and achieve delivery in a complicated area where this isn't a matter of a small number of centralized power stations. This is millions and millions of ordinary people's homes, so there's a complicated delivery about persuading people to put those in place. And sustainability concerns require, at the moment, a cautious approach to biofuels. So we'll now take questions, and David Kennedy, the head of the Climate Change Committee Secretariat, will join me because he answers all the really tricky questions. Thank you very much. Right, first question. Okay, one there. I tell you what, we're going to take it in threes so we get through them. One in the middle there, then in the middle there, and then right up to the top right-hand corner there. Okay? Good.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that excellent presentation, Adair.
And can you just say who you are and where from, so we know it? Yeah.
Ron Rodland, Welsh Assembly Government. Some people think that the elephant in the room is shale gas or unconventional gas becoming relatively abundant and keeping global gas prices very low. In terms of the world of electricity, you positively covered that, including obviously treating it as the benchmark for other things, but making some assumptions about carbon prices. But in the world of heat, there is this fascinating situation that people like their gas central heating. And if they don't believe that gas prices are going to go through the roof as oil prices might, how do you deal with that situation? Because, I mean, yes, there are some incentives for renewable heat that you're talking about, but you talked about a very challenging sort of position, and it looks almost impossible politically to start putting carbon prices on gas for home heating.
Very good question. Yep. Next question, over there in the middle. Yep.
Jeremy Nicholson from the Energy Intensive Users Group. Firstly, thank you for your comments earlier today on the radio and elsewhere. For those of us who champion cost-effective carbon reduction, I think the balanced and measured approach that the committee seems to be taking to this, and I hope the advice that's going to government, is welcome. On your slides, you mentioned that subsidies to renewables would add around 10% to domestic consumers' bills. You didn't put a percentage on large industrial electricity consumers' bills. I wondered if you cared to comment on that, and indeed whether you are advising the government, merely as opposed to merely pointing out the possibility that tax rebates could be available to the small number of highly trade-exposed industrial sectors, which we want to keep in this country and not move their emissions but reduce them.
Okay. And one at the back. There's lady at the back. There we go. Yep.
Leander Clark, PPS Group. In your opinion, what does the current and future planning process play in supporting the growth of onshore, offshore, wind and tidal technologies that we're talking about?
The planning system. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me begin, and then I'll ask David to come in at particular points. I mean, shale gas is a very interesting development, and I think, as you rightly say, we can debate whether or not there is peak oil and whether oil is going to run out, but I think the latest information on gas suggests that in terms of pure availability, there's quite a lot there. There are major issues about getting it out in an environmentally friendly fashion, and there are some dangers that the process for getting it out actually generates methane and other emissions like that. And I think it's very important that people don't think that shale gas in itself is, the answer and is a sort of, low carbon fuel. I mean, let's be clear that we're talking about the need, if we're going to be serious about hitting our 2050 targets, en route to that, to get grams per kilowatt hour of electricity generation down to 50 grams per kilowatt hour. Unabated gas is 300 grams per kilowatt hour. Now, it's better than coal at 700 grams per kilowatt hour, but it's still way, way short of what we need to do. So gas is cleaner than coal, but it is not, in an unabated form, a low-carbon technology. It's not unless we combine it with carbon capture and storage. On the other hand, within the power generation area, we may be able to combine it with carbon capture and storage. So I think you're absolutely right to say that if it is produced and if, as a result, gas prices stay lower than some of the high scenarios, the challenge will be in the residential sector of how to persuade people to move. And ultimately, you either have to tax the domestic fuel, and or you've either got to charge the high carbon, or you've got to subsidise the low carbon. There's one or the other ways through. If the pre-tax, pre-subsidy economics are very favourable to gas, I don't think we have a straightforward answer for that, and we've got to see how this develops. But you are absolutely right to identify that I think the big challenge is going to be in domestic residential heating, where I don't think we're a long way from being clever enough to work out how to do carbon capture and storage at residential scale rather than at a large power station scale. Do you want to add anything to that, David?
Yeah, I mean, Ron I'm glad you're very confident that this will not disrupt the power sector story. I think a lot of people think, well, maybe in a low gas price world we don't need to decarbonise anymore, or mistakenly that we can decarbonise with shale gas. I think there are some debates and discussions to have there. Now, if you think about it, if we're not going to decarbonise the power sector because of a low gas price, what would we do instead? Are we going to suddenly decarbonise agriculture? I think the answer is no. So our analysis says it makes a lot of sense. Even in a low gas price world, we should still be aiming to decarbonise the power sector. But I think that has to be a very clear message, and one that is reflected in our carbon budget framework and the electricity market reforms. On the heat side, I think Adair's right. The key thing is to show in the residential applications in particular that things like air source heat pumps work. They haven't had a great press in this country with the Energy Savings Trust trials. Again, does it make sense to do heat pumps in a shale gas world? And I think the answer is yes. As a society, as an economy, it does make sense, and our gas price scenarios are consistent with the kind of IEA scenarios for a shale gas world. So it makes sense to do. Once we've demonstrated, I think there's three options which we will need to discuss over the next 10 years for rolling out in the 2020s, and they are, do we want to continue to subsidise? Do we want to have a carbon price in the heat sector? And do we want to regulate, for example, through building regs, that instead of replacing your boiler with a boiler, you replace it with a heat pump if you have a suitable house?
Energy intensive users. Now, quite correct, you made the point that we had used a figure for domestic electricity bills. David, do you have the equivalent?
Yeah, I think there's a similar figure across the board. So it's a 10% increase in costs on the system, which we've just spread out across households and industry, the non-residential sector. So if you didn't do anything to address that, that's the kind of order of magnitude part of the electricity bill that there would be in the future for electricity intensive industries supporting renewable generation. Now, I think you said, are we advising the government on the specifics of what they might do to address that impact? Well, we've raised the issue. We've said there is a legitimate concern. You shouldn't be putting up the price of electricity for industries like iron and steel that are competing with overseas production in Ukraine, Russia and Brazil, for example. I mean, what will that do? It will drive investment potentially abroad, and that's not a good thing from a broader economy perspective or a carbon budget perspective. So clearly there's an issue which should be debated, which should be assessed. There is a range of solutions. We haven't got into what the detailed solutions might be. I mean, if the government were to come back to us and ask us to do a piece of work on competitiveness, then we would be open to doing that, but it's not something we will take upon ourselves to get into that level of detail at the moment.
And then on the planning thing, David, can you comment on, the question was about onshore wind and offshore wind. We do have a section on the planning issues, which are important in transmission, actually, as much as generation as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we highlight, first of all, that there isn't a great track record on getting planning approval for onshore wind projects. I think that's well known. Whether that will continue to be the case going forward, and whether it will be difficult to get the approvals for the transmission investments that we need, not just to support renewables, but also nuclear and the broader low-carbon system. Well, we're not sure, because the planning framework is highly uncertain at the moment under the new proposals from the coalition government. And so what we say is, well, certainly planning is key. We'll be monitoring this very closely, and whether there would need to be further legislative change, well, I think we've got to be open-minded on that, but planning is a key issue.
I mean, it clearly is on onshore. I mean, we do on page 106, 107, point out this interesting experience that the countries which have managed to get local approval to higher levels of onshore wind, or indeed wind in general, but onshore in particular, you find very significant levels of community ownership of the actual facilities. I believe in Denmark, 80% of all wind turbines are community owned. So the people who at a local level have voted to have the wind turbines there and take the environmental consequence of that also feel that it's their wind turbine, and they are participating in the economics of that. And it may be that one has to think about things like that in order to free up people's attitude to the planning of onshore wind. I think that, though, is a trade-off that society can make. I mean, the fact is, if we did some more onshore and offshore, we get the same amount of low-carbon energy, at least for the next 10 to 15 years, at a lower cost for electricity bills. And people need to know that that's a trade-off we are we are striking. I think the ones where we really have to make sure that the planning system does deliver the developments is transmission. Unless we can get the transmission links from the areas of a generation, be it onshore or offshore, that really is a barrier to any form of significant penetration. Right, let's take 3 more. Up the back there, yeah, and then I'll come down to here, and then I'll go over there, but I'm not forgetting other people. They'll get another shot. Yep.
Andy Atkins from Friends of the Earth.
Yep.
Thanks very much for that. Lord Tony, you said that these proposals and the targets as well really need to influence the energy market reform that's forthcoming. Now, obviously, the government's released its proposals on that, and the consultation is now closed, pending a white paper. I wonder if you can just tell us how much you think the original proposals would get us to the scenarios you've set out here, and what you would want to change by the time the white paper comes out to really get us there in the energy market reform. Thanks.
Good, great. And then, yep.
Thank you, Greg Meeks from the Combined Heat and Power Association. Coming back to the question really raised around heat, I was struck when in the analysis that was presented that district heating was put there as a technology. But really it's infrastructure, and I just question whether, as long as it continues to be viewed as a piece of technology rather than a piece of infrastructure, you're going to miss a trick in addressing the problem that you've actually identified quite rightly here about the key to renewable heat being around delivery, because the district heating infrastructure is indeed a delivery mechanism that deals with some very difficult situations that you described around the existing energy performance, the energy efficiency of the building stock, and the willingness, that was highlighted earlier, of people to switch out of the traditional wet heating systems that predominate in this country. So can we see a switch between dealing with district heating as a technology and start to think of it properly as infrastructure?
Okay, and then we'll go over there.
Yes, I'm Mr. Monfort from Moscow for the Sustainable Development. May I ask you, how confident are you with the policy and strategy on renewable energy?
The which strategy?
Let's say the policy of renewable energy here in UK.
Okay.
This is the first question. How then you relate it? I mean, the policy, because if you have a wrong policy in UK, this will be a really bad direction on, let's say, creation of job, inclusion, technology, etc. So, do you have any, let's say, knowledge-based approach on designing the strategy? And therefore, I see very little attention on information-based before you make a decision. This is the question I'm asking. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's start with Andy Atkins' question. I mean, we have been strongly involved in the debates about the electricity market reform. We think it's basically heading in the right direction. David, where are we in the precise, details of the proposals we made and where we think the government's coming out with them? Yeah.
Well, Andy asked, what would we like to see change between the initial proposal and the white paper? I think it's more important for us to say what wouldn't we like to see change, because, I mean, the proposal broadly was consistent with what we suggested in our 4th budget report. The key element of that is the long-term contracts, which is the contracts for differences. That's a specific form. And I think, as you know, there's a discussion in Whitehall around the virtues of those long-term contracts versus the premium feed-in tariffs, and we've been very clear. We think the premium feed-in tariffs unnecessarily transfer risks to investors. That will cost consumers money, and it will raise a question as well over whether the low-carbon investment is going to be forthcoming. So I think that's the very clear message from us. It should be long-term contracts, contracts for differences, not the alternative premium feed-in tariffs. Now, I say that with the caveat that those contracts have to be designed in a way that support investment in renewables and not just nuclear. That raises specific questions around, for example, what is the strike price in the contract indexed on in terms of the wholesale market. But I think those can be dealt with, so long-term contracts is the way forward. That's what we'll be looking for.
So combined heat and power, I understand entirely the point that, of course, combined heat and power, the technology is could be variable, right? So, and the district heating in particular is basically how you distribute the heat rather than how you generate it. Again, David, can you say anything about the real details of how we thought about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a major subject, let's be frank, of this report. We started in our fourth budget report to explore the technical and economic aspects of district heating for the future, and we think it's a very promising approach, whether you call it a technology or an infrastructure approach or whatever. I think it's still highly uncertain, and for us, we'd like to know a lot more about the economics and the technical aspects of, for example, taking waste heat from nuclear power generation, piping that into urban areas. But it is promising. It's not something we've looked at further in the context of this renewables review. It is something that we would like to look at further over the next months, and possibly to think about in the context of our aviation and shipping review, which might sound odd, but the aviation and shipping review actually is about the 80% target and what that means for the other sectors as well as aviation and shipping. So key issue, and one that needs to be looked at further, and as well one that the government and DEC is looking at in the context of its heat strategy.
Now, the final question was on the government's renewable energy strategy. I mean, I think we feel that, key elements of the renewable energy strategy have been being put in place. The electricity market reform will be crucial, but there are clear targets now. There is an existing set of subsidies which is having an effect. We want a more efficient system for the future, but there are strategies there. There are changes to the planning system. A lot of what we said when we produced our first report on progress 2 years ago was you've got to deliver what you said you've got. You've got to have a step change, as we called it, in the effectiveness of delivery. But over the last couple of years, a lot of the elements of the strategy are there. They're written down, and they simply have to be delivered now. I think some of the ones which I think are the trickiest in delivery are, as I highlighted, things like renewable heat at the residential levels, because that's just difficult. There aren't a small number of big levers that you pull and big industrial projects deliver it. You've got to get lots and lots of people to change, and I think there, so far in the UK, we've probably been less effective than some other countries in actually driving change down to the individual residential level. And the issue is, do we have to be a bit more forceful about that?
Yeah. No, we think the vision is there. We think the vision is there, the ambition is there, it's in the right areas. Some of the building blocks of delivering that strategy are there as well, for example, financial support. Adair has mentioned a few of the things which we think would improve the strategy, whether that is to do with making commitments on offshore wind into the 2020s, improving the investment climate that way, whether it is around questions of the transition between the renewables obligation regime and the new electricity market arrangements, or whether it's the delivery arrangements for renewable heat. So there is more to do. We shouldn't be complacent and say, well, it's all doable and it's going to happen. That's clearly not been the historical experience, so it's something we have to work hard on, monitor closely. There's a huge challenge, but we're moving in the right direction.
Right, another three. I'm going to take, oh, wow, look at this. Right. Over here, and then you there in the second row, and then I'll get you later, and then you were up hand earlier. Yeah. And then I'll go to the back thereafter, for the round after that. Yeah.
Thank you, Adair, and thank the committee for this great presentation and the work that you've done. My question
Could you just explain to the world
who
you are?
My name is Kevin Sarah. I'm the founder of Newer Energy. We have a project to import solar electricity generated in the Sahara Desert to Europe, and eventually it could be transmitted to the UK. And my question to you is, what could the government do to facilitate the development of alternatives like that, like large-scale imports of solar energy?
Yep. Okay. Yes. Yep.
It's Doug Parr from Greenpeace. I want to ask about nuclear and the costs of nuclear. Because the facetious comment would be that no one knows what the cost of a nuclear power station is until it's built. But incorporated into any cost appraisal has to be not only actual costs but risks, and that's particularly important in the case of nuclear because there are things like long-term waste management costs, long-term liabilities, major accident risk liability, which have to fall on the state because there is simply nowhere else for them to go. And I'm wondering what approach you take, which has to be a values-based approach in some way, about incorporating those risks that have to sit with the government into a simple cost per kilowatt hour, as expressed in the graphs you showed.
And finally, back there. Yeah.
Thank you. John Scott, independent consultant. Thank you for an informative report and a good amount of quantification that's in there, which I think is very helpful for drawing out the priorities. But an area which I think is hard to quantify, I don't think you've tried yet, is to pick up the number of times you mentioned the end customer. And the end customer is popping up now all over the place in this kind of philosophy of renewable energy. And it ranges from consent issues to heat to demand response to smart meters and a number of other factors. And my concern is that there's a bigger issue here than a footnote. And I'd just like to mention one item, which is some work done recently by the Institution of Engineering and Technology, who, through a poll organisation, asked 1,000 people, what do you think of the following statement, which was, to what extent does engineering and technology play a role in overcoming the global challenges of the future? And more than 35% of the respondents couldn't answer positively to that. In other words, they were don't knows or didn't agrees, and so on. And I think, we know from things we're seeing on the west coast of America and elsewhere, it's a very deep-seated resistance to some of the changes taking place in, say, smart metering. And my comment here is there a big issue sitting behind many of these aspects which we need to be addressing, maybe trying to quantify and trying to build into public policy?
Well, those three tricky questions. Solar energy, in particular, solar energy from the Sahara, I mean, it is a very interesting technology, this. We're often talking here about concentrated solar, simply driving steam turbine electricity. This isn't photovoltaics. And when you look at some of the figures for what a small percentage of the Sahara Desert could at least theoretically provide the entire electricity for the whole of Europe, it is quite startling. And indeed, unlike solar PV, which can work even in sort of the British winter, a concentrated solar is one of those technologies which is dramatically more efficient in southern Spain than in northern Europe, and even more efficient in the Sahara than southern Spain. So I do think that one of the big issues that has got to occur, we've got to have a vision of this. It could play a significant long-term role, and that does require that we have an open-minded point of view to the role of imports if they are truly additional. Now, the classic problems that we have with all issues of importing things and credits is, are they truly additional? I mean, if at the margin we ended up importing concentrated solar from Egypt and as a result they built another gas-fired station to meet their own domestic demand, which they would have otherwise met from concentrated solar, then that's not okay. If they truly do have additional concentrated solar, then it can be okay. David, do you want to talk about the mechanics of how this works at the moment? Because only, that's the principle that one has to have clear.
Only at a high level. I mean, we're very clear. There is some promise, and what surprised us was that the promise is over the next decade, not from the 2030s onwards. And so we do see an opportunity. We highlight CSP as one of a number of options that should now be considered for what we've called moderating the offshore wind ambition. I think the key thing is for the government now to go away and say, okay, well, let's consider it. If they decide it makes sense from an economic and a technical point of view, then the logistics, I think, are easily to deal with. relatively, and in terms of the legal situation, I think under the EU Renewables Directive, it is perfectly allowed to import the CSP into the UK and count it against the 2020 target. So I think the government needs to go away and take a decision. Is this something we want to allow as part of our approach to meeting the 2020 target?
I mean, on the nuclear issue, I think you're quite right to put it as you do. You know, we don't know the definitive costs of new nuclear. Of course, I mean, nuclear is not a new technology. I mean, you know, the French did go to 80% of their electricity without this having a discernible huge cost on their electricity. So I sometimes think we don't look enough at the pattern of the past. But what is also obviously true is we want to build nuclear power stations with new technologies which hopefully have much tighter levels of safety than those which were built in the past. And those are, to a degree, uncertain. They will become more certain over time. I mean, non-trivial numbers of these are going to be built in places like China pretty soon. So we don't believe, we certainly don't believe in relation to their basic costs of construction and operation. There are uncertainties, but we don't think they're wider than the uncertainties on offshore wind or things like that. They are manageable uncertainties within the economics of it. And of course, there are uncertainties which the private sector has to take. I mean, these contracts for difference will effectively give a nuclear operator a certain certainty of price and quantity of electricity delivered in the 2020s. It's then up to them to take the construction and operation risk of whether they can deal with that at a profit or not. What you are absolutely right to say is that the complicated economics of nuclear then becomes, well, what about, you know, very small probability catastrophic events, which essentially society socializes, right? It doesn't, you know, demand that the electricity generator themselves, as it were, takes out an insurance for the total and, you know, absolute meltdown. I mean, that is similar to other risks that we have in society. You can't buy, you know, insurance risk for the Earth being hit by a meteorite, etc. I mean, there are some things which are sufficiently small probability but catastrophic that we live with, we gauge them, but we don't try and turn them into insurance contracts. So you're absolutely right. I think it is a values thing. And to be honest, I guess I, like other people, you know, started this, would much prefer to have a way forward which doesn't have nuclear, because it may have that. I think those costs are, I think those dangers are very, very low probability, and you've just got to work out how low they are before you're willing to live with them. So I think that is our overall approach. We've discussed in here what we should, for instance, should take out of the Japanese Fukushima situation, of which the most simple thing is it's not a terribly good idea to build nuclear power plants on earthquake zones. Our belief, it will be looked at in detail by the Chief Nuclear Inspector this year with a report by September. Our belief is those are containable and acceptable risks, given that in terms of the bits that we can quantify, we believe that it is likely to be a reasonably cost-efficient technology. David, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, on the two things you say, Doug, I mean, the back-end costs are factored into the numbers that you saw there, so the decommissioning and the waste costs. In present value terms, those back-end costs are a very small part of the total cost of nuclear, which is really about the construction cost and the financing of projects. There is a separate thing, and there is an economic approach that tries to look at the expected value of incidents in the future, combining probabilities with what are the damages if there was an incident. And we have looked at that, and indeed I think the white paper for the government back in 2007 had some of that evidence in there. But I think you are then trying to be a bit over-prescriptive in terms of the numbers, and we had a probability number in this report, and we didn't feel comfortable with it. I think what Adair says is right. These are very small probability events with potentially significant consequences, and you have to make a judgment about what is the appropriate attitude to risk there.
Then there was the final question about the attitude of the end customer, which is really the attitude of citizens, etc. I was trying to work out what the real issue here is. I mean, you quoted this thing that people don't understand the role of engineering and technology. I think what we always have is, there are people who love putting in new bits of technology, whether it be a new form of renewable energy or a smart meter, and other people are, with a small c, deeply conservative. I mean, that and I'm sure it is the case that one of the things we've got to try and do, we have to try and capture people's imagination, but with a big difficulty compared with other technologies. I mean, if you think about how mobile phones came down the cost curve, it's because there are early adopters who helped drive it down the cost curve, because on day one, those early adopters could do something that nobody else could do, which was make a mobile phone. And so the early adopters were willing to pay a very large amount of money for a very large, clunky mobile phone, which then helps to drive it down. One of our challenges in this is there's really nothing here which does new things, right? This is, your house will be heated, right? But our house is heated at the moment. It'll be heated in a new way. It's actually quite difficult to make people love the new technology as a sort of end in itself, where what it is doing is changing the form of delivery of an existing thing rather than giving some whole new, thing which is out there. And I suspect, yes, we do need to think about how you, as best possible, get people to love the idea of, a smart meter, etc. Some will naturally, and some won't. I don't know whether you've got any other thoughts on that, David.
Well, just very quickly, I think the evidence is a bit positive in the sense that people do still care and would like to do something to tackle climate change for a number of reasons, notwithstanding all of the debates over the last year or so going up to Copenhagen and beyond around climate skepticism. So people would like to act, but I think, again, there is good evidence that people don't really know what to do. So there is a lack of engagement at the moment. I'd point you towards the Green Alliance just published a report about these kind of issues, which was looking at, is nudge enough, or do we need to go beyond nudge? And I think there's a lot of debate, a lot of work to do, and we need to work harder to engage people. When I say we, I think it's a job for the government to lead on getting people engaged. But if we can't engage people more than they are now, it's going to be very difficult to have the rollout of these various technologies.
Right.
Time for three quick ones.
Three more, and I'm going to go, there's a lady here, and then I'm going to go up to the back. There's a man there. Yeah. The one in front, right? And then, for fairness, I'm going to go to this chap over here, with the beard there. Yeah. Lady here. You good, right?
Yeah, my name is Claire Wenner from the Renewable Energy Association. I thought perhaps it was time we had a question on transport. I was interested that you did cover the costs for power and heat to a fair degree, but costs weren't mentioned at all in the transport sector. I don't know whether you can make any comments. It would seem to me that there is a cost advantage at certain oil prices to sustainable biofuels, where the potential costs for both subsidising the purchase of electric vehicles and the rolling out the infrastructure are enormous. I mean, 5,000 times 1.7 million, just on is £8.5 billion. Yep. I know that's going to an extreme, but I wonder if you could make a comment there. And the other thing, I would just like to know, 3 years on from Gallagher, given that we have had an enormous amount of work done worldwide, what your view of the sustainability concerns are, and what actually can be done about them. That is sort of specific to biofuels.
Good. Thank you very much. And up top there. Yep.
Tom Early, GHG Capital. The question is more about timing.
What about what?
Timing. We are seeing investment pace slow down.
Timing, right?
Is to regulate.
Yeah.
The question is, when do you think the regulatory changes you're advocating need to be in place to meet the 2020 targets, and what impact of delay do you expect, if there is any delay?
Okay, and I said over here. Yeah.
Tony Day. discount factor of 3.5% for nuclear and wind to produce a cost of electricity roughly competitive with current gas, is that an applied mission that these industries have to get their large quantities of capital at about a third the price everybody else has to pay for it? And second, is the committee going to produce a roadmap for the decarbonisation of the gas grid in parallel with the decarbonisation of the electricity grid?
Okay, thank you. Well, can I take those in reverse order? Because just to be clear, I showed the 3.5% figures, but the nuclear, we are seeing 2030 on a 10% discount rate. We see a range of 5 to 10 pence per kilowatt hour. I guess an unabated gas cost then of 5 to 14 pence per kilowatt hour. That is admittedly with a carbon price within it. So we don't believe that thinking about it on a 3.5% discount rate is required to make either nuclear or onshore wind or even offshore wind necessarily competitive. We think that provided we have the risk reductions which come from the electricity market reform, which give a greater certainty of price and quantity for electricity delivered, that those will then be competitive things on the cost of capital to private enterprise. I think the 3.5% is an issue that comes into the debate when people start looking at things like the Severn tidal barrage. Because then you're dealing with a thing which is pretty much completely known technology. If you built it, it would last for 100 years, right? And when you do put in 3.5% for the tidal barrage, it comes down quite a lot in cost. The point we make is that, of course, that is true, and it comes down quite a lot compared with, say, fossil fuel. But if you did apply that to that, it's not completely clear why you wouldn't also apply that to nuclear or onshore wind. It's quite difficult to provide an absolutely robust argument for doing that. But what it does illustrate, I think, all that 3.5% illustrates is that from the point of view of society, trying to think about, are these good investments for society as a whole? That's the sort of discount rate that you ought to think about. I mean, this goes back to some of the big debates within the Stern Commission about what is an appropriate discount rate to relate, future prosperity of generations to present prosperity of generations. Then you come down to that level. But it's not required. You don't have to run the figures at that level in order to make nuclear, offshore, onshore, or even offshore competitive. And we are not suggesting that those should be invested in by a green investment bank handing out loans at 3.5%. That is not essential to the economics about that. There is still a potential role for a green investment bank, but it isn't one which is just shoving out capital on a highly subsidised level. Going back to the first one on biofuels, yes, you're quite right. We didn't show in today's presentation our stuff on the costs of electrical cars. That was in our fourth budget report in particular, where we do believe that electric cars, and in particular the batteries of them, is a classic example of a technology which does have the potential to come down cost curves with volume. That is why we are supportive of a subsidy level, but I think neither we nor the government thinks that 5,000 quid will be available for everybody who ever buys an electric car. It's there to get people going. It's there to begin to get us round the chicken and egg point of why will people put in charging points unless there's some cars on the road? Why will people buy an electric car unless there's some charging points? That's why something at a much lower level than you suggest, I think it's 250 million committed at the moment, £5,000 for a number of early starters makes sense, but we believe that over time those costs will come down. Biofuels, I'd have to say, we're going to have to look at this year. We have not, since the Gallagher Review, done really detailed work at it. We did look at it a bit when we did our aviation report, and the approach we have tried to use is to say, you need to be fair about this to generate an idea of globally how much sustainable biofuels there are, and then to have a sense of what your fair share of it is. I mean, all of us could proceed by saying, well, whoopee, there's enough sustainable biofuels in the world to cover 100% of my needs, so, well, I'll have those, and then somebody else has a problem. I mean, to think straight about this, you need to say that if the world can run 10% of its aviation fleet on sustainable biofuels, you can't think about that in our own sense as being accounting for more than 10% of our own use. I think there clearly are, at certain oil prices, some reasonably sustainable biofuels, in particular sugar-based ethanol. I mean, sugar grown without fossil fuel fertilizer inputs in naturally fertile tropical areas, that is, the sustainable, truly low carbon a form of biofuels. But there's only a certain amount of that, and there's a lot of unsustainable biofuels out there, corn-based ethanol, which in itself is being grown with massive fertilizer inputs which are coming from fossil fuels in the first place, sometimes being generated by wholly perverse subsidy structures. So it is a very important issue involving both thinking about the sustainability and also looking at the technologies. I mean, people have gleams in their eyes of things which, essentially just grow liquid hydrocarbons directly, out of, you take some CO2, possibly on a carbon capture and storage, you add some energy, why aren't we clever enough out of this to, you add some water, if you've got an energy input from the sun, and you've got a CO2 input and some water input, aren't the chemists clever enough in a factory to turn that into liquid hydrocarbons? If somebody can crack that, that is a game changer, but there's no certainty of that at the moment. On the timing thing, can you comment on, David, on where we are in terms of the offshore and onshore wind build compared with what we thought? We will be commenting that in our June the 30th third progress report.
Yeah, in terms of build, well, we're on track in the sense we are broadly delivering what we planned to deliver a couple of years ago, but on the other hand, that is relatively low compared to what we need to deliver over the next decade. In 2009, we said that we need a step change in the pace of emissions reductions. And in 2010, we said we still need a step change in the pace of emissions reductions. And I think this year we'll say, well, the step change hasn't happened yet, and there's only so long you can continue to say we need a step change before we've missed the window of opportunity. So I think you're right, timing is key. And I think I'd focus on two policies where we need to see very significant progress that will drive emissions reductions over the next decade and prepare for the emissions reductions in the 2020s. And I think those are the Green Deal as regards energy efficiency improvement, which we've said here should be integrated with the approach to renewable heat, and the electricity market reform, where I hope in a couple of months' time we see a big advance there, albeit there will be some work to do over the next year or two to get those arrangements finalised. So timing is key. We need to move quickly. There is still a lot to do in the near term to lay the foundations for the step change.
Good. We better end there. Can I just, in ending, say a word of thanks to all of the other committee members, including Brian Hoskins and John Krebs, who are with us this evening, for all their work on this, and also a word of thanks for the Secretariat, who've worked extremely hard on this report, as on our other reports.